Behind every amazing flavor is an amazing human who has perfected their craft. Welcome to Flavors Unknown, a behind-the-scenes look at new flavors and the chefs, pastry chefs, and bartenders who create them, with your host, Emmanuel.
I am your host, Emmanuel Roche. Thank you very much for listening today. Every other week, I interview chefs, pastry chefs, and bartenders to discover their secrets behind the scenes. I want to know what compelled them to become a chef or a bartender. I want to learn everything about their creative process and discover the unknown ingredients that are finding their way in their drinks and dishes. Today is episode number 11. And as usual, you can find the show notes at flavorsunknown.com. Click on the episode page. My guest today is Chef Bonnie Morales, owner with her husband of the restaurant Kashka in Portland, Oregon. They serve food from the former Soviet Union. She is the first generation American and daughter of Belarusian immigrants, and she grew up in Chicago. She has received a lot of awards, and the last in dates are the finalists of the James Beard Award Foundation for the Best Chef of the Northwest region in 2018, and then the Rising Star Award from Star Chef in 2018. Hi, Chef, and welcome to Flavors Unknown. I'm really excited to have you on today.
Oh, thank you so much. Hello.
I want to start first by really setting the record straight with Kashka, because it's not per se a Russian restaurant. So can you explain a little bit the nuances, which is really rooted in history and I have to say in geography as well?
It's complicated. My parents, so Kashka is really, it's rooted in food that I grew up eating. And so that means following sort of my family history. And my parents immigrated from the Soviet Union in 1980, and I was born the year after. So I grew up speaking Russian first. When they left in 1980, they left something called the Soviet Union, which no longer exists. But physically, they were in what is now known as Belarus, and which really wasn't its own independent country until very recently. So you could say that they're Belarusian, but they never in their time could have called themselves Belarusian or would have called themselves Belarusian. And then to further complicate it, they are Jewish. My family, I'm Jewish. In the Soviet Union, that was considered to be a nationality. So even if you were living in a place called Belarus that was the Soviet Union, you were none of those things, you were Jewish. Just that one little piece of the story, it makes it very complicated to say, what am I, And so what is the food that I'm cooking? And then if you look at it, from a larger perspective of the Soviet Union as a whole, I mean, there's so much cross-pollination across all of the republics. So, something like little fish from the Baltic Sea, from Latvia, you see those jarred and used all over, in basically Central Asia. And so there's so much back and forth that, that adds a layer as well. So, my parents in that time, they were cooking, a little bit of Georgian, a little bit of Azerbaijani food, a little bit of Latvian and Ukrainian, and nobody really had a name for it because it was all the Soviet Union. So that's kind of what Kashka is rooted in, is that mashup.
And can you explain the choice of the name of the restaurant, Kashka? It's obviously an homage to your grandmother, but at the same time, I mean, it's a very emotional story and definitely, yes, the story of your family.
My grandmother was escaping a ghetto in October during World War II, and she left in the middle of the night. The following day, everyone in the town and all of her family were killed, and she made her way towards Russia from Belarus, sort of going away from where German occupation was. But there's still what they call town wardens, starosta, in Russian along the way. They're basically German appointed Russians that, make sure that everything's how they want it to be. And one of these starosta caught my grandmother along the way and accused her of being Jewish. And she said, no, I'm not. I'm Ukrainian peasant making my way. That was her story. She was a Ukrainian trying to get to her in-laws in Russia. And they said, well, if you're Ukrainian, then how do you say duck in Ukrainian? In Russian, it's utka. So they said, how do you say utka in Ukrainian? course, she doesn't know Ukrainian. She spoke Yiddish at home and maybe knew a little bit of Belarusian, but really everyone there spoke Russian besides Yiddish. But she took a stab at it, hoping that maybe the Yiddish word was the Ukrainian word, because there was a little bit of overlap. And so she said kachka, and it turned out that was right, and he let her go. It turns out that kachka is actually the word for duck in Ukrainian and Belarusian and Yiddish and Polish, probably in other languages as well in that region, but it's not in Russian. And so that story is just one of many stories in my family of like her surviving and other people surviving. And that became really important to me to honor. And that word just seemed like a great linchpin for that. But I feel like it's also a great way to honor every family's stories. Every family has suffered somewhere along the way or overcome hardships. And, so for me, it's just this one way to sort of like remember that.
And how old was your grandmother when it happened?
I don't know the exact age, but she was probably 20. Yeah, very young. She had a 3-month-old child with her who she ended up burying along the way, who didn't survive. So young, very young. I can't even imagine having a child at that age, let alone trying to navigate that situation. And it's hard to think about, the instincts that take over and what you do to survive. And it's really amazing.
Yeah, and that was a part of the journey. The journey continued after that, of course.
Oh, yeah.
That.
Yes, she ended up going on to fight in the partisan resistance and being a critical part of her group. And so I'm very proud of her, and I never got a chance to meet her. She died when my parents immigrated. I believe it was 4 years after they immigrated. So it was still the Soviet Union. So there was my parents obviously couldn't go back. And she had fallen ill. Both my grandfather and grandmother on my father's side passed away from cancer, and within a month of each other, 2 months of each other or something. So yeah, I was only 4 years old though. So I never met them.
I guess as a first generation of American, and you started to kind of reject like the food that you grew up with. Can you walk us through how you rediscover the food that your parents were serving? And I read that your husband or your future husband at that time played a specific role in that story. So
yeah, just as you said, I grew up really being pretty embarrassed of the food, not really wanting anything to do with it, and I wanted, hamburger helper and all the things that my friends were eating at home. And
really?
I thought it was like the coolest thing, all the stuff at the grocery store that was pre-made, it was like more expensive, and we never had any of that at home. Everything my mom made was obviously from scratch because it was cheaper at the time. As a kid, you think that it's not as good, but it's crazy because so much of that stuff is garbage. Yeah, that's what I wanted. I wanted what all my friends had, which is normal, And anyway, yeah, my husband now, when we were dating, I brought him over to my parents' house, just normal sort of stuff. And I whenever I had any friends or a boyfriend or anything coming over to my parents' house or any sort of like family party, I always gave them a warning of the food is going to be really strange. You're not going to like it. I'm sorry. You might want to come fed. So I gave him all those same sorts of warnings. And then afterwards, we were in the car driving back and he just stopped and was like, that was amazing. I loved everything so much. It was delicious. And I loved, the way everyone ate together and sort of the camaraderie and how it all went down and the food and everything. And he was just sort of smitten. And yeah, so that the first few times that he would say stuff like that, I just assumed he was saying it to, make nice.
Yeah, of course.
But that just kept happening. And anyway, my mom caught wind of this and she started getting really excited. He would ask her questions about things. And she started inviting us over for dinner just because she was whipping up some dish that she hadn't made since before they immigrated, so he basically sort of lit this fire in her and then in me too, to sort of reevaluate and rediscover what I just took for granted for so long. And that definitely changed just the way my perspective on it altogether. I would say I had a sort of a paradigm shift of what this food means. Yeah, it's all because of that. I remember, being in culinary school, for example. So, as a young adult, And, you have to do this like project designing a restaurant concept. And so I thought just for fun, I was like, oh yeah, I'll do a Russian restaurant. And so I wrote this menu, I had this logo and everything picked out that was like, whatever. It was a fun project. And then when I wrote the menu, everything that I did to it, all the dishes that I put on it were so apologetic. It was like, I would take a Russian dish and then just change all the techniques to French, or something like that, where it was just so respectful to what the cuisine does. For example, there's something called холодец, which is like a meat aspect, like a cold jellied meat dish. And there's no clarification process. You're not supposed to clarify. You're not supposed to make a consomme and then add gelatin, which is how you would do it if you were making, a French aspect. It's very, very rough and it's meant to be rough. So but in my vision, that just because it's rough and more simple, it must be worse. So I spent all this time, I remember this moment, I spent all this time making this, this dish in aspic where it was supposed to be this other dish холодец. And I spent days making it, and the finished product, when I sat down and ate it with my family, everyone was kind of like, that's okay, because it lost so much of its character. And I think I just didn't understand. I just assumed that it was wrong because it was Russian. That's something that has changed in me since. That's something that my husband's influence has done, is I don't make the assumption anymore that just because it's Russian or whatever from the Soviet Union, that it's automatically worse or wrong in some way.
You said you went to culinary school. So when was this sparkle in your brain to say that, I want to become a chef?
That's complicated. I mean, my parents owned a restaurant actually when I was younger. They opened a restaurant with their friends. It was a huge disaster. It was basically everything you shouldn't do to open a restaurant. And I know I worked there. And so as a result of that, I think I had more telling me to not go down that path. But so it just kind of happened anyway, though. So I went to college for product design, for industrial design. And I graduated from that and, sort of got my dream job in that industry. I was really interested in design research more than actual development. I was working at this design firm in New York doing exactly that. I was sort of doing just the design research part of it, which was really rare to be able to get coming out of school. So anyway, it was just this perfect job. And I absolutely hated it in practice. Doing something in school, oftentimes it's just not the same thing in reality. And this is a perfect example of that. And I just hated it and I was miserable. But I would walk through the Union Square Farmers Market on my way to my work. And all I wanted to do was stay there and just check out all the produce. That was my first time really living somewhere and experiencing a real farmers market. And that opened my eyes. And I would buy things all the time at the market and go home and make them. I remember I had this, or now it seems so silly, but at the time, Odo, or what's Mario Batali's Enoteca that he had in New York at the time was kind of new, but he had an olive oil ice cream or olive oil gelato. And I remember going home and wanting to make that. I made I'd get basil from the market and make basil gelato, whatever. I just got so excited about this way of cooking. And it sort of sparked this interest in me that I think that my parents having their own restaurant when I was younger had basically suppressed. And so anyway, I quit my job and went to culinary school, which was probably, a very sort of rash decision, but I don't regret it at all.
Yeah, obviously. And then in 2014, you started Kashka. So I guess that obviously you faced that a lot of the challenges that every, one faces when they open a restaurant. I'm interested to if there's anyone listening that is in this mindset and say, that's what I want to do. I want to open a restaurant. So I want to understand the kind of challenges that you face. And then at the same time, I want to understand as well if you had additional challenges, because you're talking about opening a Russian restaurant in Portland. And then probably there's a lot of people that were what are you talking about? What is that? What kind of food are you going to make?
Yeah, I mean, that definitely, and it sort of, we had that extra challenge. I mean, you could also say it's an advantage if you do it right, but the challenge of nobody knowing what you are and why you should exist. And in fact, Russian food, a lot of cuisines might have sort of people might have no knowledge of. But in many ways, that's better than what we are up against. People have a very negative connotation of Russian. They think of the, food shortages and lots of spoilage, and they think of, canned vegetables. I don't know. They think of very drab or no vegetables often. They think about like meat and potatoes and very limp vegetables. And I don't know. It's this picture that shows up in people's minds is just not positive. And so they think, why would I want to go to a Russian restaurant? We have people who, will tell us that they had to like drag their friends in because they kept saying, no, I don't want to go there. And then they come and they're like, oh my God, I can't believe I haven't come sooner. That for us is certainly the biggest hurdle. You can also say that, like I said before, it can be an advantage because if you do it right, there's not a lot of competition directly in that way. I mean, there aren't any other restaurants that do what we do in Portland. I would say that at this time, I have yet to see anybody doing what we do in this country. And I'm not saying that to brag. I'm just more astounded by it, that there aren't more people representing the cuisine in the way that we are. And that's disappointing.
And why Portland? Because, you were in New York, then Chicago. So why Portland?
Well, I mean, that speaks to, you were asking before about general like suggestions for people opening restaurants. I mean, Portland's a much easier market to enter. It wasn't so strategic, but it is in reality, like a liquor license in Portland's, under $500 a year. There's a lot of major markets, thousands and thousands of dollars, the rents versus other cities, all those sorts of, it makes it easier to be an actual. So like my husband and I are the only owners. We're the only people in the business. We don't have any partners. We don't have any investment firms. And so we don't have a bank. I mean, I guess we have a bank now, but there's nobody else that's calling the shots. They're telling us what to do. And that gives us a lot of creative freedom. So it makes it, you have a lot of times when you have to have a partner who's not maybe a restaurant person, they'll come in and be like, you know what this place needs? We need a burger. Or something like that, where you have to kind of come to the table and have that conversation. And if that's not what's best for the restaurant to keep it true to itself, then you dilute it. So anyway, in Portland, it's just a lot easier. And so there are more places like us that don't have any big money behind it. It just keeps it more, I think, more fresh, more limber. So that's something that makes Portland great. I mean, the other thing is the produce is amazing. There's a lot of really great forest product. Like the mushrooms out here are just phenomenal. We supply the country's chanterelles and they're all here in our backyard. So they're pennies. I mean, right now you go to the grocery store, it's like $7.99 a pound for chanterelles. So it's just these beautiful berries, all that kind of stuff. It just can't compete. I remember having a strawberry in Portland. I was out here for my brother's wedding. And having a strawberry out here, and it just like that literally made me want to move here. It was that good. So, that's a big thing. And the size of the city, the population makes it really sustainable. I have this like constant feeling that I live as part of a community. So I walk down the street and somebody honks their horn, and it's, this guy that used to be our general manager, and he now owns his own metal shop and he does metal work for some of my friends. And then I turn the corner and it's our mailman, and I know him because I see him all the time. And, it's just like, it feels like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and everybody knows each other, and it just makes it feel like you're part of something.
Do you feel as well that the clientele is more open to like new type of food? I mean, you are a city that has one of the highest density of food trucks, in the country. So, and where in fact there's a lot of different kind of food being served and from different, ethnic influence. So
I definitely think it's related to the food trucks because, it's a low investment, low risk, right? So the people starting it, it's not a lot of cost up front. And so they can take a big risk. And then as a customer, most food truck items are not more than $10. And so it's a pretty low risk on your end if it's not very good. And so it encourages businesses and people to try things that maybe they wouldn't have. And so you have just so much knowledge as a result of it from the customer side of cuisines, of ingredients and things like that they probably wouldn't have otherwise. Yeah, it totally makes them more willing to try something new. The one negative of that is that they're also very, very quick to move on to the next new shiny thing. because there is just such a high density of restaurants. So it's not all, it's not all positives. There is a negative stuff, but the fact that they're willing to come in and give it a try, even if it's a little bit strange, is definitely a huge win here in Portland.
You guys didn't go the food truck route because you could have, but you went directly with the brick and mortar and open, Kashka. Opening a restaurant is obviously very stressful and complex. So do you have any tips? It was like 4 years ago. Do you have any tips for people that may be interested in getting in a restaurant business?
Don't, I guess, is a big one. You have to be crazy. You have to really, really want it. You have to love what you do. Obviously, it's not a new idea that you should have worked in restaurants. That's definitely 100% true. I also think that you have to really spend time understanding so many different parts of it. So one thing that works really well for my husband and I is that I've worked in the dining room and he has a culinary degree. Because we both know a little bit about each other's area, it means that we can hone each other, and that also that we have different parts of the business that are critical. So if we were both in the kitchen, I would feel a little uncertain. And it works for some people. I'm not saying it's wrong, but for us, I so often am thankful that I know that I have an equal partner in the dining room that has the same vested interests, because sometimes you can tell, like, if both the partners are in the kitchen and there's not an equal weight in the dining room, that sometimes their message isn't being communicated the way that I think that they would want. And then if the person who owns the business they have a hired chef, I think a lot of the times that translates to food and you don't see the same attention, or maybe there's just a mismatch in concept, The other thing is to not underestimate the personnel hiring, and the people are it's an ongoing constant thing, because you can't I guess you could make food with robots. Hopefully it won't end up there. As of right now, everything that happens in a restaurant is so high touch, requires humans. And we are complicated people. We are complicated, right? And everybody has different requirements, and what makes them tick changes. And that's the most complicated and always changing ground. I know for me, when I thought about opening a restaurant, I didn't think about personnel. I thought about the menu, right? And training my cooks, let's say, and thinking about like sort of the parts of the restaurant that happen in that space, and not about, what happens in between. And it's just, people have messy lives. You have to figure out a way to navigate that. I don't know. It's really interesting. I feel like I have to wear an HR hat more and more now than I do like a chef hat. As an owner, you do all of it. So I know about health insurance, and I know about 401k plans and taxes and all of the things that aren't cooking.
So let's focus a little bit on the food. You have, when you look at, have a look at your menu, you have different sections. Can you describe a little bit those different sections that you have there?
Our menu focuses heavily on something called zakuski, which comes from the word zakusit, which means to bite after. And so these are dishes that are meant to be bites after drinking. And it's not the same as saying drinking food like I'm going to a bar. When Russians say zakusits, they mean like at the dinner table, like they're having a full meal. It's just that the majority of your time is spent on these zakuski. Like at somebody's home, you walk in and the table should already be full with dishes that are these zakuski, these cold dishes. And everyone sits down and you spend, like, I would say 75% of your time eating at this course. There's a lot of toasting and drinking. And so anyway, as a result, our menu focuses super heavily on that. I think it's almost half of it is zakuski, maybe even more. And some key dishes, herring under a fur coat is something we're well known for. It's not something we created. It's a very classic Russian layered salad with salt-cured herring and some root vegetables and mayonnaise. We also have a smaller section of something called hot zakuski, and those are dishes they're usually things that involve dough in some way, but they're dishes that are they usually follow the cold zakuska table, but, as a sort of intermission, somebody will pass around some stuffed buns with, some hard-boiled egg and onion inside or something like that. So piroshki. Our hatsukuski change quite a bit. I would say one that we have on the menu quite often is called hachapuri. That's a Georgian yeasted bread with cheese. It's hard to explain only because there are so many different kinds of hachapuri. I know that there's one that's people know pretty well because it's been popular lately. There's ajaruli, which is where it's a sort of eye-shaped and open, and there's like a egg and a pat of butter in the center. And that's one that's been photographed a lot and people know, but that's just one of dozens of kinds. Right now we're doing an Emerulian style one, which is like a closed hachapuri with some smoked sulguni cheese inside.
And the dumplings are not part of that section, correct?
Technically speaking, you could consider the dumplings to be types of hatsukuski as well, but we focus on them so much that we have our own section for that. And that's definitely what we're probably most well known for. And that was intentional. It's kind of what we focused on the most and what we wanted to be known for, just because we think dumplings of any kind are sort of an easy way for people to be introduced into any cuisine, because I can't think of a single cuisine that doesn't have some form of dumpling. It's a great way to start. Anyway, we have had 3 different kinds on our menu since we've opened the same 3 ones. There's something called Siberian pelmeni, which are a mixture of beef, pork, and veal. And then there are 2 different kinds of vareniki, sour cherry and tvarog, which is a type of farmer's cheese. We do ours a little bit on the savory side. Oftentimes you'll see those more traditionally. You might find them to be either neutral or a little on the sweet side. More recently, when we opened in the new location, we added a 4th SKU. Right now we're doing and I'm kind of sad to get rid of it. I haven't had a chance. I haven't wanted to take it off yet, but in theory, it's supposed to change. It's a potato dumpling with a caviar beurre blanc on top. Kind of hard to let go of it.
Those dumplings are absolutely delicious. I discovered I didn't know anything about the sour cherry vareniki, and this is phenomenal. that's really good.
As a young girl, the sour cherry vareniki were ones that my mom would always buy at the Russian market and have in our freezer. And that was something that when I was a teenager, if they were going out, that's something that I could make myself. So that was a favorite thing. It feels like you're cheating. It doesn't feel like a real meal because it's just fruit with dough. So that was what I would make myself, and I used to love it very much. So that's one when I taste. I like my version better, but when I was working on that was very much inspired by that memory.
So where is your then inspiration come from? You're talking about being inspired, with this product that your mom was buying, and that's your memory of it, and so on. So is the goal to have, an execution of dishes that are mimicking the real food, the real experience that's from the time during the Soviet Union? Or are you allowing yourself to have little tweak now and there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I like to use the word reverence. I think reverence is very important. So to just say, sour cherry vareniki, that's sour cherries and flour, water, egg. I'm going to take all those ingredients and now make something totally different. It doesn't it doesn't look or reflect that at all. I'm going to dehydrate the cherries and I'm going to take that. I'm going to make a cracker instead. And I'm going to take the butter that you dress it with and powder it. That's not, to me, the essence of the dish. That's not how you would enjoy it. And so I don't like to change things in that way. I think that could be a really interesting cerebral exercise, but that's not what I think we're here for what I do. I view it more like, I think we've talked about this before, but I view this as a design problem. So I have this dish that I know that I grew up with and I liked it, but there were problems with it. I identify what those problems are. For example, in those dumplings, the cherries are always fresh cherries, and fresh sour cherries have a sort of wateriness to them in their nature. So you're never going to really, and then you throw it in boiling water, and so now you're just adding even more water to it. And so as much as you want, I remember as a teenager just thinking wow, why is this? I want this cherry to be more cherry, Or the dough can be very thick depending on how it's shaped and what tool you use to make them. You can end up with really sort of thick parts, sort of clumpy, thick, knotted parts of dough. So, the solution to that is there's a specific kind of dumpling maker that if you use that, you don't end up with any knots. It's all like cinched evenly. If I make sure that people are using a certain thickness of dough, then we avoid that problem. I can use really delicious dehydrated sour cherries and rehydrate them in sour cherry syrup and make filling out of that. And so I'm still totally 100% honoring the dish. It still looks like what it is. It still has all the same bells and whistles, but it's just tastes like more concentrated cherry, but it is what it is. So in that case, like you're just, and the other one with dumplings specifically is you normally, when you order them and you go to someone's house, they just give you a bowl of dumplings. And then on the side, there'll be a pat of butter, a little bowl, or maybe a pitcher of vinegar, some salt maybe, and you just put whatever you want in your bowl. Well, I know that if I emulsify butter in the wet dumplings, that it'll make a delicious buttery coating and it makes its own sauce. And I know this as a chef, so why wouldn't I do that? Why would I not dress your dumplings for you? Which is a silly thing. It seems obvious, but yet nobody ever does that. They always serve them dry. And I will season the amount of vinegar in there that I think is appropriate, right? Yeah, it's a design problem. What's wrong with it as it is? Because nothing is ever totally perfect. And if it is, then I don't touch it, and then why mess with it?
Being French, I love rabbit, and you have a delicious dish on your menu that I love. Like this is the rabbit in a clay pot. So can you talk to us a little bit of the inspiration behind that dish?
Rabbit in a clay pot's a very, very traditional Belarusian dish. In Belarus and in Russia too, so sour cream is used first of all, sour cream is not like what sour cream is here. Sour cream here isn't really sour cream. It's basically Frankenstein food. A real sour cream is cream that's been thickened and thickened by culturing.
Is it the smetana?
Yeah, so smetana, we use cultures to make it like smetana. A lot of places have. There's creme fraiche, right, which is a little bit sweeter. But every culture has this America once had sour cream too. So, but it's just more like industrialized sour cream and not really American, but industrialized sour cream isn't real. So you can't necessarily do the same thing with that. But if you have some sort of real cultured sour cream, it's then like a sauce. You can use it for everything. In Russia, one of the things that people do is they braisen it. Very, very common to braise in sour cream. Rabbit in a clay pot is traditionally just rabbit that's braised in sour cream. And that's really what it is in its essence. And you serve it with potato cakes and that's it. I wanted to throw tons of garlic in there and tons of cherries and tons of porcinis. I just wanted to sort of make it heady with these competing strong flavors, which are all traditional to Belarus: sour cherries, porcinis, and garlic. And so I just infused it with more of any one of those things that most people would think is normal to do. And we serve it with all of those components. So there's chunks of porcini, roasted garlic, like whole roasted garlic cloves, and sour cherries. Because it's all these sort of unexpectedly like heavy amounts of each of those things, but they're all in check with each other. So it's like if you just had a ton of garlic and nothing else to compete with it, it wouldn't do the same thing, right? And same thing with the cherries, right? They'd be too sweet. But there's such an intense amount of all of them that they kind of keep each other in check. But the inspiration for the dish was, I was asked by Food and Wine to do a recipe for spring. So that's kind of where this came from. I wrote the recipe for Food and Wine based on it was springtime and this is what I wanted to have. And I don't remember the exact, maybe it was February at the time that I was writing it, or maybe January. They responded back saying that they loved it, but they couldn't publish it with rabbit because
I was thinking of that.
They asked me if they could do it with chicken. So you can find it. There's a recipe on Food and Wine with it.
Yes.
In buy. And I was so angry that they did that I was like, well, fine, I'm going to put it on my menu then. So I did it on the menu, and unfortunately we can't take it off. I've tried to, and my husband got very angry with me because I was so sick of it, and we took it off the menu. And people were like upset they'd come in and want it.
Okay, good. That was my next question. I was thinking that are the people really enjoying the dish because there's a lot of rejection because it's rabbit.
Yeah, no, I think it's, I hope there's no reject, but I hope that somebody would tell me. No, it's one that we sell a lot of. It's very popular and people come in just for it. And yeah, it's great. It's just funny for me. I was actually in my first trimester with my second child when I was writing that recipe. And at the time, no big deal. But then when we put it on the menu, I would walk in the mornings and there would be this strong smell of roasted garlic in the kitchen. Just that happened to be something that would make me nauseous in my first trimester. So I had to suffer through it through my entire pregnancy. And so even now when I smell my prep cooks working on it in the morning, I will be reminded of being pregnant and being miserable. So it's haunting me, but it's okay. I don't mind.
You can mention that to your kid now.
Yes. He's only 2 now. So
okay.
Maybe
it's a bit too early.
Wait till he's a little older to start serving him. Yeah.
Keep it on the menu then.
Yes.
So another thing which I've found very interesting, and I learned that from reading your book Kashka, which is an outstanding cookbook. That grilling is another very interesting common points with the tradition of grilling here in the US. This is something that was part of different countries, of course, from the former Soviet Union. And then you have different tools. So the grill, you call it mangal, and then you have the champuri that are, I think, the skewers, correct? So can you explain the differences though that exist between your type of grilling with the one, that people in the US know?
The device is called a mangal. It is a sort of a trough, almost a long, skinny box that you put your coals in, and you balance skewers across the top. And the skewers are called champuri, and they are usually flat, broad, because you can then you can sort of shape farces around it. If it's flat, it gives it more surface area to stick to. Or you can skewer a whole fish, because if it's a broad skewer, it has, again, something to hold on to. There's sometimes people will do pieces, and it does come more from the Caucasus, but during the Soviet Union, that became popular everywhere. And to this day, if you go to Belarus in the summer, my uncle always, or my dad's cousin, the exact relation, but he complains. He's I'm sick of mangal. We have it every night. It's pervasive. It's everywhere now. It's a thing throughout the Soviet Union. But yeah, the idea of skewering and grilling on an open flame rather than on a grate, I guess, is the biggest way to think about it. And there's also a heavy use of marinade a lot of the time, strong marinades. A lot of the times you'll see recipes where it's straight, you marinate in straight vinegar overnight, 24 hours. You'll see lamb, for example, marinated for 24 hours in vinegar and onion. That's it. Almost denatures the proteins. And so it's interesting. It's it's a very, very strongly flavored style of grilling, which is cool. I like it a lot.
And this is the technique that you are using in your restaurant, correct? For some of the dishes that you have, okay?
Yeah, we have. So we built at the new restaurant, we built a whole hearth for making a mangalin. So we have a whole section of skewers now.
I was fascinated when we talked at your restaurant of the story that you and your husband are bringing or brought your staff, and I think that you're organizing another trip to Belarus to experience really the country and the meeting the people and obviously the ingredients and the food. So can you explain to us why you organized such a trip, for part of your team? There's not a lot of people doing that.
We're two major factors. One is I am constantly thinking about how working in restaurants is hard. It's hard. It's not very high paying. Just margins are so tight in restaurants, and people who do it, a lot of times out of passion, but anything I can do to give back, I try to. And so this was for us a way that we could thank people that had been working for us so hard. And so that was a big part of it. And then the other part that's sort of, more for the restaurant is there really aren't a lot of resources for the cuisine to learn about it. If I have a French restaurant and I want my staff to learn about French food, there are so many different places I can direct them without ever leaving Portland. a lot of times without even leaving the comfort of their own couch. There's a lot of stuff on the internet. There's just not the same level of information for Russian and Belarusian and all that. We wanted to just take people there because in many ways, we have to be the source of that information. That's why we wrote the cookbook. Same thing. There hadn't been a book published in the US in almost 30 years on the subject. 30 years. Since the information isn't there, we have to be the one to give it to people. And so taking some staff to the source was part of that. You see it. The cooks we have who are still with us that went there obviously use that. But really the way that servers and bartenders speak to guests, instead of being able to say, I was told that this is a traditional dish, they can say, I know that this was a traditional dish because I had it in, somebody's house in Borisov or something like that. And so that giving people that knowledge is really great. And you can see the light behind their eyes when they talk to guests. And that's so important too.
And was it a good tool as well for you to, to retain people working at the restaurants?
Yeah, definitely. I don't have any numbers. I can't say, exactly what our retention rate is and all of that, but I feel like it is. I want to continue doing it. We did it. This was more like an experiment. We're like, what would happen? What would happen if the only rule was you had to have been, we asked for, I think, $500 and that's it. Everything else we covered. So we said, if you give me $500 and you give it to me by this date and you are currently working at the restaurant at the time that we go, then that's it. That's the only requirement. You could have been here for a month. You could be here for 4 years. It's all the same. Like, just if you want to come, you come. So it ended up being 50% of our staff that went. So the total, including my parents that came with us and my kids, it ended up being 24 people. It's really cool, but it was also really challenging. I'm not a travel agent. And that was part of it too. We were like, well, let's just see so that we know in the future. I definitely think that was too big and I don't want it to be such a big trip in the future. But other than that, everything else about it was great. And so we're talking about how we can do that in a different way next time. And we're talking about doing it this summer.
As I mentioned to you when we saw each other, if you have an extra seat, and you can send me an email. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
We're almost at the end of the discussion here, Chef, but I have 5 rapid fire questions for you.
Okay.
So where do you eat in Portland, or you have a drink where you are off the clock?
Coquine. I love Coquine. My favorite restaurant.
Can you give us like 3 dishes that you could not live without cooking or eating?
Tomatoes with mayonnaise and like any sort of soft bread or a biscuit in the summer, of course, when tomatoes are perfect. Tomatoes and mayonnaise sandwiches. Unbelievable. Any ice cream. There has to be ice cream in my life. And I guess anything with a French omelet, honestly, that's I've always wanted.
What are like the main misconceptions that people have about vodka and caviar? Together
or each separately?
No, separately. Sorry.
So vodka, you can't talk about it in like an intellectual way, that it just meant to just go down quickly. But it has a lot of characteristics to it. You can taste differences, I think that's the biggest misconception. Caviar, man, there's so many. It's hard to pick just one, but I think probably my biggest one is that it has to be served ice cold. It drives me crazy when I see it served on crushed ice. Everything tastes better closer to room temperature. And if you're spending that much money, why would you want it to be numbingly cold? So serve it at room temperature. Obviously you want to store it in the refrigerator, but when you're serving it, you should actually spend some time letting it come to room temperature so you can taste it more.
And beside the cookbook Kashka, what is your other favorite cookbook?
The Joy of Cooking, probably. It's super dated and all that, but I reference it all the time.
Thank you very much, Chef, to be on the show Flavors Unknown. It was real pleasure to have you.
Pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening today. No worries if you were not able to write down some information that our guest was talking about, because you can find all of those in the episode show note on flavorsunknown.com. And if you are enjoying the show, please leave a review or a rating as it helps other people to find it as well. If you have friends that are foodies, please send this podcast their way, as I am always happy to have more people listening. I see you in 2 weeks, and until then, remember that people who love to eat are always the best people.
Thanks for listening to Flavors Unknown. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to leave a review. Find the show notes at flavorsunknown.com. And if you want to join the Flavors Unknown community, search Flavors Unknown on Instagram and Twitter.